Hi there. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can import your Postman configuration into Dittofi. So, first of all, what is Postman? Well, Postman is a really popular tool in the world of API development. It's gained really wide usage as a tool to help rapidly develop and test API integrations. You can access Postman on a free tier by visiting www.postman.com and then clicking to sign up. So when you first sign up to Postman, you'll get pulled through to your workspaces page. From inside here, you're able to connect to different API endpoints and save down the configuration for connecting to different endpoints. In this example, I'm going to connect to this JSON placeholder API. So this API is a test API that you can access for free on the internet. I'll include a link to this API in the description below, but you can also just Google JSON placeholder API in order to find the site. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to go into Postman and add a new collection. This is going to be the collection of API endpoints that I want to connect to. I'm going to rename this collection to Postman Endpoint Collection, like so. Next, I'm going to click on this blue text here to add a new request. The user interface inside Postman is really nice, so it automatically directs me to rename my request. I'm going to call this Get Posts. I am then going to go back over to the JSON placeholder API and go to the section of the page that has the different paths for the JSON placeholder API endpoints listed. I'm going to click on this first one here, and as you can see, the response from this endpoint is displayed directly inside of the browser. I am then going to copy the URL for this endpoint by pressing Ctrl+C on Windows or Command+C on Mac in order to copy the URL. I'm then going to go back over to Postman, where I'm going to paste the URL of the API endpoint right here. So in Postman, you can change the API request method, but in my case, this is just a get endpoint, so I'm going to leave this set to get. To test this API request, I can then click send, and as you can see down here, I get a response from the API. The data that is returned from the API here corresponds to the data that we saw in the browser from the JSON placeholder API website. You can see the data for that here in my other tab. So okay, everything is working. So what I need to do now is to save down the request configuration by clicking Save here. Then after this, click to save the endpoint response. Right, so now I can quickly add another placeholder API in the same way by clicking Add Request and then copying over another API endpoint from the JSON placeholder API in the same way. So I'm going to grab the URL, run the endpoint inside Postman, save down the request, and save down the response like so. Now I have a couple of API endpoints that I've configured here. I can now export the configuration for these endpoints by clicking on these three dots to the right of my collection here, and then by clicking Export. This file that downloads here is the configuration file that I'm going to import into Dittofi. Okay, so now that I'm inside of Dittofi, to import my Postman configuration, go over to the Dittofi Web Services tab, which is the fifth tab over here. The Web Services tab is used to build API integrations. Here I'm going to click on Add New Web Service, and then I'm going to choose the option Import from Postman. I'm then going to select my Postman configuration, which is here. Okay, so now what has just happened is that Dittofi has imported the Postman configuration and converted this into a web service inside of Dittofi, which takes the name of the collection of API endpoints that I created inside Postman. I can click on this web service and you can see here the list of endpoints that I have just imported from Postman. You can also see the protocol used in the API here, which is HTTPS, and the path of the host API here. You can click on any of the API endpoints to see the configuration of each of these endpoints. One thing to notice is that the variable type that is used to store the API response is seen here. Dittofi tries to pick the correct response type for this variable based on your Postman configuration, but if you've skipped a step in the configuration, this might be wrong. So if you get an error at a later stage when you're actually running this API endpoint, it's most likely that the variable type that will be used to store the API response is set incorrectly. Okay, so at this point, the API is completely set up inside Dittofi, but to actually run this and see the result, you need to come back over to the Backend Actions tab and click to add a new backend action. Next, rename the action. I'm going to call mine Postman Test. Choose the trigger to be endpoint. Then add a new event. Select the option for HTTP request, which is under external. This event will allow you to run an HTTP request against one of the web services. In my case, I am going to choose the new web service, which is this Postman endpoint collection. And then I'm going to choose one of the endpoints that I want to hit. In my case, I'm going to select posts. Then I can set the response variables to posts and post code. So this posts variable is going to store the post data that is sent back from the API. And this posts code is going to store the response code from the API. Once this configuration is set up, click Save and then go over to the trigger endpoint and set a response variable in our endpoint to point towards our posts variable. Finally, click the Build Code button in order to convert all of this configuration into code. And once the code is generated, let's click the Run Action button here and then run to start the endpoint. And here we go. Here is the response from our JSON placeholder API. As you can see, the data here inside of Dittofi corresponds to the data that was returned inside of Postman and the data that was returned when we ran the API on the JSON placeholder API website. Inside Dittofi, you can see all of the code that was generated for the API request by clicking on the Code button here to view the code for the action. So that's how you import a Postman configuration file into Dittofi. Please let us know if this video was helpful in the comments, or give a thumbs up so that we know to keep making content like this.